Okay, so we're diving deep into this whole herpes thing today, huh? Looks like you've really pulled together quite the collection of like articles and studies and stuff about all the myths floating around out there.
It's definitely a topic where having accurate information is so important. There are just so many misconceptions, and it's easy to see why people get overwhelmed or even scared.
Yeah, for sure. It's one of those things like everyone's heard of it, but it feels like nobody actually knows the real deal.
Right.
First things first, though, these stats about how many people actually have herpes just totally blew my mind.
Yeah, they're pretty eye-opening for sure. Like, did you know the World Health Organization found that two-thirds of the global population has HSV-1?
Wait, seriously, two-thirds?
Yep, two-thirds. And that's just HSV-1, which is the one that usually causes, like, cold sores.
Wow. Okay. So basically, most of us are walking around with some form of herpes then.
Pretty much, yeah. And it's not just cold sores either. I mean, the CDC research you shared found that 1 in 6 adults in the U.S. has HSV-2.
Which is the one more commonly linked to genital herpes, right?
Exactly.
See, that's a way bigger number than I think most people realize, which honestly kind of makes sense when you think about all the fear and stigma around it, you know? It's like this hush-hush topic nobody wants to talk about.
It's true. And that article you sent over, the one from Slate, about the history of herpes stigma, it was a really interesting read. It seems like a lot of the fear we see today kind of stems from, like, those alarmist public health campaigns back in the 80s and 90s.
Those PSAs, yeah, I vaguely remember those. They were pretty intense.
Yeah, and looking back, they probably did more harm than good,
Yeah.
honestly. Like, instead of promoting open, honest dialogue, they kind of just pushed the whole conversation underground.
Total irony, right. Trying to raise awareness, but actually just making it even more taboo.
Exactly.
So, with all that in mind, let's talk about this big myth that seems to be like at the root of all this fear. Herpes means my life is over.
Ugh, yes.
Yeah.
It's completely understandable why someone would feel that way initially, with all the stigma and misinformation out there.
Yeah.
But that statement is just not true. Not even close.
Not even close, right? You mentioned actually before we started recording that you yourself had felt particularly uneasy about that whole herpes is forever thing.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the biggest misconceptions out there, and I think it really plays into those feelings of hopelessness some people feel after a diagnosis. But what the research actually shows is that, well, yeah, okay, so there's no cure yet, but it paints a much more manageable picture than that phrase suggests.
More manageable, how so?
Well, for one study actually found that people who have had HSV-2 for a decade or more, they actually shed the virus way less often than those who are newly diagnosed.
Interesting. So it's not this like static, unchanging thing, like your body actually learns to handle it better over time.
Exactly. It's not a life sentence. Your body is working with you, not against you.
That is reassuring. And then, of course, there's treatment. We'll get into the specifics in a bit. But even just knowing that antivirals exist is a game changer, right? Like, it's not this thing you just have to live with passively.
Absolutely. And speaking of treatment, that actually brings us to another myth we see all the time. The idea that there's no treatment for herpes. Like, antivirals can significantly reduce both how often you have outbreaks and how severe those outbreaks are.
Which is huge. Okay, so we've tackled that whole my life is over myth, which, by the way, listener, it's not. But now let's get into another big one that I know freaks people out: transmission.
Ah, yes. Transmission, the how, the when, the where, it gets complicated.
It does. And even though herpes is so incredibly common, there's still a surprising amount of confusion about how you actually get it.
Which, again, just feeds into the fear and makes it harder to have open conversations about it.
Totally. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only one who, like, totally freaked out about the whole you can get it from a toilet seat thing at some point. But at least the research was very clear on this one, right?
Oh, absolutely. Herpes is primarily spread through direct skin-to-skin contact.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about, okay, this is where it gets kind of confusing. What about asymptomatic shedding?
That's a great question, and definitely something that causes a lot of anxiety, especially for people who are newly diagnosed.
Right. Like if you don't even know you're contagious, how can you prevent passing it on?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So first, it's important to understand what asymptomatic shedding actually is. It basically means that you can transmit the virus even when you don't have any visible sores or symptoms.
Okay, so no symptoms, but still contagious. That's a little scary. But how common is it really?
That's what's important to understand, right? Like, it's not this constant looming threat. From the research I looked at, it seems like asymptomatic shedding is more common in folks who get frequent outbreaks.
So someone who rarely, if ever, has outbreaks is less likely to be shedding the virus without knowing it. That makes me feel a little better, honestly.
Exactly. Awareness is definitely important, but it's not like you have to constantly be on high alert. Knowledge is power in these situations.
Speaking of knowledge, before we get into treatment and all that, I want to clear up one more thing about transmission, especially since it pops up a lot in the context of oral sex. So we were about to get into the nitty-gritty of oral sex and herpes transmission before we took a break. What's the deal with that? Is it like always a risk?
Yeah, it's a question that comes up all the time, and for good reason. The answer, though, like with a lot of things related to herpes, is, well, it depends.
On what?
In this case, it mainly depends on like what type of herpes each person has and where it's located. So, for example, if someone has oral HSV1, the type that usually causes those, cold sores around the mouth, they could potentially transmit it to the genitals through oral sex.
Gotcha. Yeah.
It's a little complicated.
Yeah, and this is definitely where knowing your own status is so important, right? Along with having those like open and honest conversations with your partner about their status too.
100%.
Yeah.
Communication is key in any relationship, but especially when it comes to, navigating sexual health.
For sure.
So to circle back to your question about oral sex, it's definitely something to discuss with your partner, and just understanding the risks involved is important for everyone.
That makes total sense. Okay, so moving on from the mechanics of transmission there, I'm curious about the treatment and management side of things. I know you really dug deep into the research on this. What stood out to you?
One thing that really struck me while I was going through everything you sent over was like how much emphasis there is on daily antiviral medication as the treatment for herpes. And don't get me wrong, those meds can be super effective for a lot of people. But I think it's important to remember that they're not the only option, and they're definitely not necessarily right for everyone.
You're right. It's easy to get caught up in the idea of a like quick fix, a magic pill.
Mm,
But managing herpes often involves a more, well, holistic approach, right?
totally.
Yeah.
And that's where all those other resources you shared come in, like figuring out your own personal triggers, things like stress, certain foods, lack of sleep, making some like dietary tweaks even, or just getting serious about stress management. All of that can play a role.
And we're not talking about like crazy restrictive diets here, right? From what I gathered in the research, it seemed like just being mindful of lysine and arginine in your diet might be helpful for some people. What are those again? I always forget.
Oh, right. So lysine and arginine are both amino acids, which are basically the building blocks of protein.
Yeah.
And they both play a role in how our bodies function, but lysine seems to have like antiviral properties, especially when it comes to herpes.
Mm.
Arginine, on the other hand, can sometimes actually promote viral replication.
Oh, interesting.
So, yeah, it's not about avoiding arginine altogether. We need it to survive, but it's more about like finding a good balance.
Okay, that makes sense.
And a lot of people find that adding like lysine-rich foods to their diet, things like, fish, chicken, legumes, or even taking lysine supplements can help reduce like how often they have outbreaks, or at least how intense they are.
So it's like giving your body that extra support it needs to like keep things in check.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I love how all the research you shared really highlights, the whole range of options, because what works for one person might not work for another, right?
Mhm.
That personalized approach is so important.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about like the mental and emotional aspects of living with herpes. I feel like those often get like totally overlooked when we just focus on the, physical stuff like outbreaks and transmission.
You are so right. A herpes diagnosis can bring up so many like complex emotions, especially with all the stigma we talked about earlier. Shame, fear, anxiety, those are all completely valid reactions.
It's totally normal to feel those things, and it's not like something you can just, brush off or ignore. That's why having a solid support system is so crucial, I think. And thankfully, there are so many amazing resources available now, both online and in person. You even included some like great links to the support groups and online communities and stuff in your research.
Yes, those communities can be absolute lifesavers for folks. They offer this like safe space to connect with others who truly get it.
Yeah.
Who understand what you're going through. You can share your own experiences, get advice, just realize you're not alone in this, which I think is huge.
It is huge. That feeling of connection, of not being alone, it makes a world of difference. And speaking of feeling alone, I think we need to talk about dating and relationships, because that's often like a huge concern for people when they're first diagnosed with herpes. Like, how is this going to affect my dating life?
Oh, for sure. And it's definitely an area where I think all those myths and misconceptions we've been talking about can be particularly damaging. Like that whole idea that if you have herpes, you're somehow like undesirable, that you can never date or have a fulfilling sex life. That is just straight up not true.
Ugh, it's so frustrating that those myths persist, even now. Yes, herpes might change how you approach conversations about sexual health, but it absolutely should not be a deal breaker in a relationship.
Exactly. And, those disclosure scripts you found, those were so great. They offer, like, really practical guidance on how to talk to potential partners about it, and in a way that feels, comfortable and authentic to you.
Yeah, those seem super helpful, especially for someone who might be, like, feeling nervous or unsure about how to even bring it up.
Definitely. And one of the, like, biggest takeaways I got from those scripts is that it's all about normalizing the conversation, right?
Yeah,
Like, at the end of the day, herpes is so incredibly common.
way more common than most people think.
Exactly. So chances are, the person you're dating has either had some experience with herpes themselves or knows
Yeah.
someone who has. It's not this big, scary, unusual thing.
Right. And it's so often that our fears about these things are rooted in this idea that we're somehow different or like damaged because of it. But the reality is that herpes is just one aspect of who we are. It doesn't define us.
I love that. It's about reframing the narrative.
Yes. It doesn't define you, and it certainly shouldn't dictate your worth or your ability to have amazing, fulfilling relationships.
Well said. And I love how one of the sources put everyone has something, right? We all have something we bring to the table, our own unique set of experiences, challenges, whatever.
Hmm.
And STI diagnosis is just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
What a great analogy. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about treatment options, that more holistic approach, the emotional and social aspects, all really important stuff. But before we wrap up this herpes deep dive, we need to circle back to testing. Because ultimately, knowing your status is really the foundation for everything else we've discussed, right?
So true. It's the first step in, like, taking control of your sexual health. But even around testing, there are, like, so many misconceptions and myths floating around.
Seriously, it's almost as if, like, the myths about herpes have, like, multiplied and created these little myth babies around testing, too.
Yeah. Myth babies.
Oh, yeah.
Love that. Okay, we got to use that. But yeah, it's easy to see how those misconceptions pop up
Yeah.
because herpes testing isn't always like the most straightforward process. Like, sadly, even some healthcare providers aren't always up to date on all the details.
Oh, really? That's a little unsettling.
I know, you'd think they would be the experts, right?
Yeah.
But it just goes to show why it's so important to, like, be your own advocate and to get, accurate information from trustworthy sources.
Preach. That's what we're all about here.
Exactly. So let's dive into some of these testing myth babies in part 3, shall we?
All right, Herpes Mythbusters, welcome back for the grand finale of our deep dive into all things herpes.
Grand finale. I like the sound of that. We're tackling those testing myth babies head on, right?
We are. So one myth I kept seeing pop up was that herpes tests are like automatically included in those standard STD panels you get tested for, at the doctor's office. Is that true?
It's a good question because you think it would be, right? But unfortunately, no, not always. Those standard panels usually just focus on the more common infections like chlamydia, gonorrhea, HIV, that kind of thing. Herpes testing is often something you have to specifically ask for.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you really have to be proactive and advocate for yourself there, huh? Because otherwise, you might not even know to ask.
Yeah, for sure. So the gold standard, like the most accurate test, is a swab test. But they can only do that if you have an active outbreak, with visible sores.
Which makes sense. You'd need an actual sample of the virus. Right. But then what if you don't have an outbreak but still want to get tested? What are your options then?
That's where blood tests come in. So blood tests, they check for antibodies, which are those like little signals your immune system sends out when it's encountered a specific virus.
Gotcha. So if a blood test comes back positive, it means you've been exposed to herpes at some point, even if you've never actually had an outbreak.
Exactly. Which, by the way, debunks another common myth we see, that you can only get tested during an outbreak. You absolutely don't have to wait.
Which is huge, because as we've learned, you can be contagious even without symptoms.
Exactly. Knowing your status, symptoms, or no symptoms is like so important for making informed decisions about your sexual health.
Knowledge is power. It always comes back to that, doesn't it? Okay, so we covered that testing isn't always a given, that different types exist, and that you don't need to have an outbreak to get tested. What else about these tests should we know?
Good question. Accuracy is another big one, and unfortunately, no test is perfect, right? But herpes testing in particular can be a bit, well, tricky to interpret sometimes.
How so?
Well, so remember how we were talking about blood tests looking for those antibodies?
Yeah.
Well, it takes time for your body to actually make enough antibodies to be, like, detectable by the test.
Hmm.
So if you get tested too soon after a potential exposure, you could get what's called a false negative.
A false negative, meaning like the test says you're negative, but you might actually be positive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It just means it's super important to talk to your doctor about the timing of the test.
Okay, so if someone's concerned, talk to their doctor about like the right timeline for testing and definitely advocate for themselves.
100%. Don't be afraid to ask questions.
Love it. Well, I feel like we've covered so much important ground today. We tackled all those pesky myths about herpes, explored like all the nuances of transmission and treatment and testing, and we even talked about how to navigate those sometimes, like kind of awkward conversations about sexual health.
Awkward, but so important to have.
Totally. And I think the biggest takeaway here is that, yes, a herpes diagnosis can feel overwhelming at first, but it absolutely does not have to rule your life. Like, knowledge and open communication really are so powerful.
So well said. And hey, if you made it to the end of this deep dive, you're already on the right track.
You got this. And don't forget, listener, we'll be sure to link all those amazing resources in the show notes, so be sure to check those out for even more information. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and take care.